According to the new report from Canada's federal housing advocate, Marie-Josée Houle, tent encampments represent a life-or-death crisis. The report into homeless encampments says that Canada needs a national response plan led by the federal government. It also says the current housing and homelessness system is broken. For reaction to this, we've reached Michele Biss, who's the National Director for the National Right to Housing Network. Hi there.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So 25% of the homeless population currently lives in one of these tent encampments, according to this report. How did we get to this point?
Yeah, well, as colleagues in British Columbia might say, the prevalence of encampments has really been happening for some time. But I think what we're really seeing is the way in which COVID-19 really exacerbated the homelessness crisis in Canada. We're seeing the ways that the unaffordability crisis in relationship to housing, we're seeing a lack of affordable housing. We're seeing also that, frankly, income is not keeping up with the cost of housing. And on top of that, there's a lack of tenant protections to make sure that folks aren't evicted for totally preventable reasons. So what I think we're really seeing is a demonstration of the ways that homelessness is being exacerbated.
It also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it is an indication of agency on the part of those who are homeless as well, of trying to come up with a solution themselves as opposed to relying on the agencies that are out there. What would you make of that analysis?
Oh, yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. What's interesting about this report is that it centers the dignity of those who are living in encampments. And the shelters are notoriously underfunded, and there's concerns if you're living in a shelter, you might get kicked out one morning, have to go back the next. There might not be space the next time that you go. At the crux of this report is this need to meaningfully engage with people who are in encampments and find out, why are they there? Where have they tried to go otherwise? And the reality for people in encampments shouldn't be, your options are you live in a shelter day by day or you live in an encampment. We can do so much better. And I think that's why we see in the report this need to massively upscale social housing, to address social assistance, to really get at the root causes of Canada's homelessness crisis, to figure out what it is that's needed to get to that root and address homelessness.
When we talk root causes, what do you think is still being ignored? Because it seems that research has been done, that those who are in the field have told those in power about some of those root sources for a very long time. What is the gap that's not being understood then?
Ooh, well, this could be a long answer. I'll cut myself off. Well, what we know is that the minister has 120 days to respond to the report. So, I'm honestly quite hopeful about this minister. What I will say is I think that they're taking a big pivot in the way that housing and homelessness policy is created in Canada. We saw the federal government re-engage in housing policy really quite recently, just in 2017, where there had been a gap for honestly decades. But what we have seen, I think, with the existing housing strategy is investment in housing, but not necessarily affordable, adequate housing for those who are the most marginalized. So what will be up to this minister as he works on the encampment response plan that Marie-Josée Houle has been calling for is to also make sure that the new housing policies that are created are genuinely focused on ending homelessness and on addressing core housing need.
That national response, because the report is calling for this national encampments response plan that would end the forced eviction of encampments, as we were saying. What kind of difference would that make?
Well, I think it would show some federal leadership, right? Because we know every jurisdiction handles encampments very differently. And in some cases, there are some really terrible policing practices, for example, to disperse encampments. But what we need is some national leadership to get everyone on the same page, to find a consistent response, and also space to be able to bring together rights holders, advocates, people who hold solutions at the municipal level to come up with some solid solutions. But at the core of it to make sure that we're focusing on the dignity and human rights of those who are in encampments, because those who are experiencing homelessness have had their rights violated, right? And we have to focus on solutions that have us step up, that have the government stand up as those duty bearers.
It is interesting, though, and I certainly I know this is not where Michele was going with talking about a national encampments response plan, but it is still responding to encampments that are out there as opposed to getting at that root that you were talking about.
Yeah, I think the report, it's not about entrenching encampments, but what it is about, I would argue, is about respecting people's human rights while we work on those long-term solutions.
Mm-hmm. As opposed to making it an either-or.
Exactly.
The call for ensuring people in encampments have access to justice was an interesting piece of this as well. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you're interpreting that?
Sure. Some of that just comes down to talking to people, right? Talking to people who are rights holders. Oh, my goodness. Excuse me. I'm sorry, listeners. Talking to people who are living in encampments, making sure that when they raise concerns about encampments, that they aren't being met with punitive measures, making sure that they are centered as rights holders who hold dignity, who hold a special relationship with their community inside of the encampment.
It's in the report, Marie-Josée says that Canada has the capacity to solve the crisis. How optimistic are you about that?
I think Canada does have the capacity. And we saw, for example, in terms of jurisdictional collaboration with the COVID-19 crisis, we saw governments come together, and what it takes at its core is political will. I think that they have the mechanisms to do it, and we know from the last years that it is possible.
Michele Biss, thanks very much for your time today.
Thanks so much.
Michele Biss, the National Director for the National Right to Housing Network.